How has the Middle East become its disorderly present? Is it the colonial legacy?
I call them boutique powers that are sort of relatively small but have become outsized in their influence.
Is it the sectarian and ethnic dimensions?
All these states that were created after 1918, after 1945, Syria, Lebanon, and so on, Iraq, they've developed real nationalism.
In the latest episode of Disorder, I speak to the renowned historian Simon Sebag Montefiore about his new book, The Cauldron, The Making of the Modern Middle East. He explained how this region has been transformed and fought over by many empires, national movements, ethnic revivals.
The reason why the Allies were so opposed to the Ottoman Empire was because of the Armenian genocide.
And how that influence has shaped power dynamics throughout the region today. Let us order this disorder. Yours is truly a work of Herodotean ambition. You seek to essentially explain the war between the Persians and the Greeks by going back to the beginning of what to him was known history, or in our case, the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, to get at how did Israelis and Arabs and Persians fall out, and then struggles between Armenians and Kurds over nation building denied. Is this the correct framing to understand the modern Middle East, to look back to the falling apart of the Ottoman Empire?
Yeah, I think you've got to go back to the Ottoman Empire. And, you know, I wanted to start it in exactly 1900, but you couldn't really start in exactly 1900 because you've got to go back, as you know, to Tanzimat, to the Crimean War, and to the career of people like Muhammad Ali the Great of Egypt. So there's all these kind of key figures that you've got to know about to understand the modern Middle East. And you're only going back, you know, just over 100 years, 125, 150 years. But it's impossible to understand anything without doing so. And, you know, when I looked at this book and started to think about how to do it, you know, I realized that there's so much disinformation and ignorance now and such a little lack of knowledge, which is really unhelpful to understanding where we are today. And I don't just mean Israel-Palestine, but with Iran, with Turkey. And so I realized that you had to have a starting point around 1900, because in 1900, it's a good year to start, because the Ottoman Empire is still intact in the Middle East. It's decaying in Europe, in the Balkans, but in the Middle East, they still rule. And so Abdul Hamid is a key figure to understand. And, you know, what's interesting about when you look at these figures, that's one of the interesting things about history is you look at someone like Putin or Erdogan in Turkey or leaders like MBS, and they're actually facing some of the same questions that their predecessors did who were in Constantinople in the 19th century or in Arabia in the 19th century. And so it's worthwhile to look at that. And the key thing about this was that, you know, this book doesn't exist and hasn't existed, and it should have existed. There are plenty of books on the Middle East. There are plenty of books on the Arabs and the Jews and the Turks. And of course, Israel-Palestine is an industry now, and there are thousands of books on that and on Gaza. But no one's really put it all together. And that's what I'm trying to do. And I'm one of the people that can do these sort of books.
We are talking intellectual influences now. So tell me about others. What are the history books on other subjects that you read, that you enjoy, that have shaped how you look at the world?
Well, I read endless amount of history books, as you can imagine, and I'm sure you do too, Jason. And it's like, I mean, Simon Sharma's Citizens was a formative book for me, and on the French Revolution, of course, because it's such a brilliant book. In its narrative history, at its best, in the sort of narrative history that I wanted to emulate, and so I love that book, and. I mean, other books, you know, I've read so many books. I've read all those books from it. I love Bernard Lewis. I love Harani. Eugene Rogan, we mentioned. Eugene Rogan is unusual because his book, The Arabs, which is of the sort of modern Arab world, is one of the sort of most balanced books on this subject.
On this talk of intellectual influences, what you're doing differently, just to really clarify for the readers, is that you're putting the Armenians, Kurds, Persians, and a range of outside actors into the Middle East.
That's right.
And that I think that that's the only way this story could be told. And it really fits as to why this is a disorder topic, because what we believe here at Disorder is that there is no there and here anymore. Everything that's happening there is happening here.
Yeah.
Everything that's going on with China and AI or the closing of the Strait of Hormuz, it's literally happening in my living room. And you do a great job of showing that that was actually always the case.
Yes. I mean, it's more the case now just because everything is moving so much quicker. Communications, markets, and supply chains are now so interlinked in a way that, you know, obviously there's always been international trade. There's always been globalism, actually, even in the ancient world. But what I wanted to do with this book, this anecdotage, yes, I mean, we see today, we look at the world today, it's exciting. And history should be exciting in the same way. And, you know, I wanted to show that interlocking nexus of personality, of ambition, of nationalism, of religion, of aspiration and ambition. And so I also want it to be, deeply, deeply researched. It has to be correct. And, you know, and that's always a struggle in the Middle East because there's so many different versions. But I also want it to be read, to be entertaining, to be exciting. And I want to reach people who don't always read books on foreign policy.
To get into the details, we love to talk about Kurds and Armenians and Alawis and Pontic Greeks and Phanariot Greeks and Druze and Yazidis and the Shia. And I was really impressed that your book covers the content about these groups that I spent so much of my life living amongst. Let's jump in with the Kurds. I learned something new that I'm not sure most people are aware of. You sketch that British officialdom, either in Whitehall or in the Cairo office, promised certain Kurdish leaders a state in the fallout of World War II, and then they squashed Sheikh Mohammed Barzani, either as part of their desire to hold on to the oil riches of Mosul, or the need to keep the whole Iraqi territory tethered to Baghdad. I've never researched that, but could you really explain us what is the idea that the Kurds, whether it was King Crane Commission or at Versailles, were promised a state? Most people don't know this.
Well, what I think that the interesting part of this is, yes, the Kurds are always left out of these stories. And the Kurds are a sort of huge population.
We're talking 40 million.
We're talking 40 million people across 4 major countries.
And maybe 6, depending on how you count it.
Yes. And they're hugely important. And what's interesting about today, and it's just good to look back, so why we're discussing this now, is that, you know, in federal Iraq now, you know, the Kurdish autonomous region is really the kind of closest the Kurds have ever got to a sort of state. And of course, it's divided by feuds between the two dynasties, the Talimbanis and the Bazanis, which you know all about, and which in itself is a fascinating sort of tribal, political, sectarian, ideological, and personal kind of rivalry.
And to briefly interject, the two forms of Kurdish, Sorani and Karmanji, are almost non-intelligible.
Yes.
And there are so many different roots of different Kurdish religion and traditions. Yes, most Kurds are Sunni, but like so much is going on, from Faili Kurds to other things. So, but let's get back to this quote unquote being promised a state that you write about. Well,
the state, there are various promises were made in the Sèvres and San Remo treaties, and particularly in the Sèvres treaty, which dealt with this part of the world, you know, what is now sort of the Turkish Republic and Iraq. And the question was, what would happen to what is now Eastern Turkey, Western Iraq? And it could have gone many, many different ways. So you had a situation where the French were coming up from the south into what it used to be called Cilicia. North of that, there would be some sort of Armenian state promised by President Woodrow Wilson, often called the Wilsonian Armenia. And there was talk, there was discussion, and in fact, it was agreed that the Americans would have a mandate over that republic, weirdly, which of course never happened.
The Armenians.
The Armenian state.
Yes.
And also further in that region, there would be some sort of Kurdish autonomy. Further east to that, in what is now the province of Mosul in Iraq, there would be a plebiscite to see if the Kurds wished to have an independent state. And if they did, the idea was that those two parts would be put together into a Kurdish state. So it wasn't an explicit promise of a state. It was promise of a plebiscite to decide if there should be a fully independent Kurdish state. And of course, the Kurds would have voted for it, but it never took place.
Fascinating. And just like the King Crane Commission and lots of things that happened at Lausanne and San Remo, events on the ground, my dear boy.
Yeah. Well, the biggest events, the biggest events were, of course, Ataturk and the Turkish rebellion against the British-French empires, and a series of wars, many of which are forgotten now. The first one was against the French in Cilicia. And the French were basically, he made it so costly for the French to be there that they in the end would kind of ultimately withdraw. The second one was much easier, the destruction of the Armenian state, such as it was, which was easy because the Armenian state was far less organized than the Turkish troops he had. And of course, he had actual Ottoman armies at his disposal. Well, these were all makeshift.
Of course, and because most Armenians have been genocided.
Yes. So that was that. The Bolshevik, he also made an alliance with the Bolsheviks, who also were against the creation of these states for different reasons, and who were just really consolidating their control of the Caucasus, where they created an Armenian Soviet Socialist Republic. So lots of the different worlds move here. At the same time, there's the question of what to do with the Mosul province, where there is oil. And the British decide that they want that to go to Iraq, as you said, tethered to Baghdad. And they are just forming the Iraqi state. And so the last thing they want is that to go to this new Turkish entity under Ataturk, under Kemal Pasha. So at the same time, though, Ataturk, the future Ataturk, is sending troops into Mosul to backing all sorts of people to undermine the new Iraqi state. The British hoping to get it for Turkey. Of course, as usual, exploiting the poor Kurds. And at this point, Barzanji comes in and declares himself king of the Kurds. And it's a time of declaring kings. The Hashemites and actually managed to, I mean, you have to call it a Game of Thrones, because at one point or another, the Arab family of the Hashemites from Mecca have five thrones, I think,
who's
or
counting?
more. Yeah, who's counting when you've got thrones coming out of your ears like that? So, but all of this didn't happen because, of course, the British crushed Barzanji using different paramilitaries, the new Iraqi army, such as it was, the British forces, and Assyrian paramilitaries. And, very interestingly, because they were a favoured ethnic paramilitary group.
Of course. Both the French and the British tended to like to work with minority Christian
or Alawites.
groups.
Or the Alawites in Syria, which I know you know all this, but it's so interesting, isn't it?
My Fulbright and my doctorate are about the Alawites.
There we are.
So I get to the tragedy here of betraying our allies, and the things that the Kurds and the Armenians have in common is largely having been favorable to the West, largely in the case of the Kurds practicing moderate Islam, and, that's a buzzword, but in the case of Armenians being Christians and looking to the West, as well as to St. Petersburg, and being abandoned and rejected and abandoned and rejected and let down again and again and again.
Yes.
We are much better to our enemies than we are to our friends in this region, so we have to talk about the Armenians.
Yes.
Why? Why, oh why has the West again abandoned their Christian Armenian brethren in their time of need over Nagorno-Karabakh? Is it Azeri oil? Is it the lobbyists that the Azeris have? How could we have abandoned them after World War I?
Yes.
Abandoned them during the genocide, and abandoned them again just now?
That's right. So it's really to do with the nature of Azerbaijan and Azerbaijani oil. By the way, I was in the Karabakh in '93,
Nice.
and I was in Zangilan. We were under attack from Armenian forces, and the Armenians then were winning, of course.
We had on the pod former Armenian President Armen Sarkisian, who explained because of Armenian dominance after diasporic help right after the fall of the Soviet Union, they avoided getting to permanent status, thinking that, they could have more dominance and more territory. And that moment of hubris was so tragic.
Yeah, a bit like the Israelis after '67. And so they didn't really consolidate. And as a result, they've lost it all again now. But, this brings us to one of the themes of the book, which I'm sure we'll return to, which is how powerful these Middle Eastern states now are in the West. And Azerbaijan has proved extremely adept at that. And of course, it's a sort of dynastic state. I mean, I interviewed President Aliyev in the early 90s, the father. And of course, it was, the son now inherited the presidency. And Azerbaijan has become one of those interesting states. I mean, I call them boutique states or boutique powers that are sort of relatively small, but have become outsized in their influence for various reasons. And for Azerbaijan, it's because it covers, it's an oil state, it's a Turkic state, but it's a Muslim state, but it's a Soviet state. It's got strong secularity. It's also friendly with, it's always had very good relations with Jews. There was a huge the mountain Jews of Azerbaijan. And so as a result, it's got this kind of interrobang nature that it kind of can face several different ways. And that gives it a great pivotal power, which makes it important. So it's an example of why the Caucasus now has to be included in the Middle East.
100%. And I think it's also an importance that it shows the fluidity of Middle Eastern politics. Like you could say one of these other boutique states, Qatar, it's always going to be opposed to the Emirates. The nature of Qatari politics is opposition to the Emirates.
Yeah.
But then all of a sudden in some dynamics in the Trump administration, they work with the Emirates and with the Trump administration.
Yes.
And then we could say, it's impossible that Kurds and Turks will work together.
Yeah.
But actually you were sketching a situation where Ataturk and the Kurds were willing to work against the British in certain ways. And this fluidity is captured really, really well. And it gets at the possibility, despite outsiders saying, the Middle East has these ancient hatreds and it's always been this way, that it's among the most fluid regions where alliances have changed the most.
That's right. I mean, that's why it's good to talk to you who know the region so well, because one of the big sort of podcast cliches, which are repeated and again in hot takes, is all these things like the Shias and the Sunnis can never work together. The Kurds and the Turks can never work together. And of course, then you've got the sort of Saudis and the Emiratis working together, and then suddenly they aren't. So or the Saudis, are friendly with the Qataris, or they're against the Qataris. They're besieging the Qataris. Of course, they all hate each other, but that doesn't mean you can't work together. And that's why the Israel situation is much less hopeless than it seems in many ways, because, there may not always be formal recognition, diplomatic recognition, but these states already know each other quite well.
I want to go back to that World War I moment because it's so pivotal, both to how you start the book, but I think to sketching the mega lessons. I think we have to talk about Chanak and the British and French abandoning of their Greek allies post-World War I had not thought of this analogy until I was reading your book, but let me tell you what happened, everyone, then. Essentially, in the fallout from World War I, Lloyd George and Clemenceau and some others were like, the Greeks have been our allies, the Italians are our allies, the Turks have been our enemies, there's this huge Greek population in Ionia that goes all the way back to Herodotus, and we should let them, control the extreme bit of Western Turkey. And they supported what was called Venizelos' great idea. And this is irredentism for an expansionist Greek state. And then what do you know? The Greeks began to lose battles and it fell apart and it really imploded and it allowed this huge Turkic backlash and 100,000 Greeks were killed and people had to flee. And as I was reading it, I was like, oh my God, this is like people from Brooklyn supporting expansionist settlers in Israel, conquering yet another hilltop and then having some ideological reason to do so. It's bound to fail. And then there's going to be this backlash of expulsion of Jews from the West Bank or whatever. Am I onto something with this parallel?
Yeah, there is a parallel. And I think, but there are other parallels that are also relevant. I mean, we've got to realize that the reason why the Allies were so opposed to the Ottoman Empire was because of the Armenian genocide. And the word genocide had not been invented, but the idea of these massacres meant that, like, anything Turkish was like, had no kind of moral legitimacy in their eyes, despite the fact that there was a Turkic sort of heartland in Anatolia, what is now
Of course,
Turkey,
since about the 10th century.
since around the 10th century. And of course, as you said, it also contained, around 1 million Greek Orthodox. So what happened was that the Allies decided that they would just dismantle the whole Ottoman Empire and leave the Turks only a kind of block, which at this stage is still called the Sultanate. It's still the Ottoman Sultanate, but it would be just a block around Ankara and on the Black Sea. And the rest of it, they were going to divvy up. They were going to get Constantinople was promised to the Russians, but when the Bolshevik Revolution happened, it was then going to be an international city under the British and French. Then there was a kind of large sector around Constantinople. Then we've already talked about how in the east what they were going to do with the Armenians and the Kurds, and then there are the Italians and the Greeks, but particularly the Greeks, who were longing for more territories after vast losses in World War I. So Venizelos has this kind of idea, and it's very popular among the Greeks. It's a sort of Byzantine concept. And so they give him a strip of Ionia, what used to be Ionia, and then the Greek army just advances into Anatolia, and they almost make it to Ankara. And there are hundreds of thousands of troops on both sides. It's a huge war. And if you compare it to other famous wars, I mean, just jumping ahead here to compare it to 1948, for example,
it's a much bigger war.
The armies were tiny.
Of course.
In the Nakba of Israeli War of Independence, the armies were all sort of started off at sort of 5,000 or 10,000 people. These are World War I size armies of like 150,000. They have massive battles, but they are facing Mustafa Kemal Pasha, who is one of the military geniuses and political geniuses of his era. And he has a proper Ottoman army, fully supplied, which is intact. And they defeat the Greeks totally in battle after battle after battle. And then you have this massive ethnic cleansing of what is now Eastern Turkey, climaxing in the sort of monstrous massacres of Smyrna and so on. And the numbers are huge. I mean, obviously...
a million Greeks leaving their homes.
A million Greeks leaving their homes, hundreds of thousands of Greeks being killed, untold numbers. And of course, Turks are also killed. Hundreds of thousands of Turks are also killed. And it leads to this massive population swap, which creates Turkey.
I want to say that this is actually the defining moment of the switching from the Ottoman-style Middle East with its Millet System to the quasi-European nationalist post-19th century ethno-homogenous system.
Yes.
And we have been dealing with the tragic consequences of that ever since, because the Ottomans were not as tolerant as everyone says, just like the Umayyads in Spain were not as tolerant as they said, but they didn't have the idea of ethno-nationalist religious states because you were a dhimmi or a millet and there was a cosmopolitan empire. And yes, Sunni Arabs were on top, but things largely worked in a certain way. And you could say that this is the culminating moment of moving to a new system.
Yeah, a new paradigm, which then we see in all sorts of ways. We see it in 1947 in the Raj, funny enough. It's not just the Middle East. It's a new concept of religious nationalism it defines nationalism by history, by language, and by religion as well as ethnicity. And those things are sort of put together. And you see that very strongly in the creation of Turkey, which we're discussing. But then to jump forward 20 years, you see it again in 1947 in the partition of India and the creation of India and Pakistan, two states that had never existed before, and which in the case of Pakistan especially was a sort of this combination of religion and a new nation, a national concept built around religion, history, ethnicity. And then we see it in 48, of course, in the creation of Israel and the fallout from that. And these three events are incredibly similar. Obviously, the India-Pakistan is by far the biggest. You have 12 million, 14 million people moving. You have 1 to 3 million people being killed. In this case, 1922 in Turkey and Greece, you have, well over 1 million, 2 million people switching lands, being expelled. And And then, of course, we have 48, which we may discuss later. But it is, you're right, it's the new paradigm.
I like how you sketched that new paradigm, Sebag. I think that one thing that happens in the academy is people jump from this understanding of the history, which they do get, to then saying the problem is the ethno-nationalist state. We all need one stateism. Well, Kurds and Turks can all live together in a one state, and you know, Israelis and Palestinians can be in a one state, and you know, the Baluchis don't need to have any justice for their wrongs because it shows you that the old model was best. That's also flawed thinking, no?
Well, it's also flawed thinking. I think it is helpful to look at the idea of European nationalism and the nation state and whether it is applicable to this region at all. You know, a region that is like for all sorts of reasons.
Sadly, it's been made through population transfers and cleansing, say, of Arab Christians to become more and more.
It's becoming more and more feasible. And of course, you know, all these states that were created are, you know, after 1918, after 1945, Syria, Lebanon, and so on, Iraq, they've developed real nationalism. Now, there are people who think of themselves as Iraqis. When King Faisal, the first of Iraq, was writing about Iraqis, he said they have no clue. They're not Iraqis. They're Kurds. They're Turkmen. They're Sunnis. They're whatever. And so he grumbled. You know, he said that they'll never be governable. But in fact, you know, there is now a concept of Iraqiness and Iraqis. So they did develop nationalisms. It was also interesting that the Western powers, the imperial powers, kind of embraced Arab nationalism too, and the idea of Arab national states, and created them. And of course, it's also interesting that today, when especially sort of a certain sort of, you know, intellectuals, decolonialist intellectuals, now have complete disdain for nation states in our own West, they still expect those states to exist in the Middle East, which is an interesting dichotomy. And you might well ask, why is that? Why is that the case? Why is it good enough for them but not good enough for us, or vice versa? So there are all sorts of kind of strange inconsistencies on this subject. But I think the future, funny enough, if you look at what's happening in Iraq and some of the agreements in Syria now, and the possibility of new developments in Lebanon, there might be new concepts of how these states could work, which are more sophisticated than a one state solution in all of these places. And again, I mentioned the Kurdish state in Iraq, because it's surprising that we could even talk about Iraq in any shape or form as an ideal governance, and it's got massive problems still, and it's cursed, stricken with militias and so on. But that is a sort of thing that could work, and I've always believed that would be the best way for an Israel-Palestine
a kind
solution.
Of confederation.
Yeah, I don't like the word solution because there'll never be a solution. There aren't solutions to these problems. Certainly not acceptable solutions. Again, we go back to Turkey and the Greeks. The solution was the ethnic cleansing of everybody, after millions of years, after thousands of years. And of course, that would not be acceptable in our era today. And it would not be acceptable for any kind of sensible, you know, spectator.
So, Sebag, one of the things that's unique about your book is that you bring in Iran, Armenians, the Kurds, Sudan, and how it plays into this cauldron of the core Levantine Middle East. I want to read you a quote about how you're depicting Iran and kind of debate it with you. You wrote, "The young Shah, presiding over a disorderly but vibrant democracy, as a constitutional monarch, shared the outrage of most Iranian politicians at Stalin's attempt to dismantle the state, always a sensitive issue in a country that encompassed many minorities." So it's fascinating. As we look at Iran, you and I know that less than 50% of Iranians are ethnically Persian.
Yeah.
And that their Shiaification only happened 4 centuries ago. And of course, there are so many minorities. But was the Shah ever a constitutional monarch?
He didn't want to be, but he was, yeah, because you've got to remember that the Shah ruled for 40 years, which is a considerable time. And in that time, the Shah, who's one of those very misunderstood leaders, for all sorts of reasons, which your viewers will be familiar with, but when he inherited the throne in 1941, Iran was being partitioned between the Soviets and the British under Churchill. Stalin and Churchill divvied up. And this is a kind of a sort of one of those, I think, slightly forgotten episodes in the history. And so he had to function in a kind of partitioned country controlled by them. And of course, it was because it was controlled militarily by those two powers that they had the Tehran Conference there in 43.
And the reason that they had partitioned it, just to be clear, is because of oil, because Anglo-Persian and particularly the refinery at Abadan and the British zone, these were so critical to the global economy. Yeah. It's like Hormuz was now.
Exactly.
So then it wasn't about shipping. It was about the fact that refining capacity for the whole globe was in one position. And then the Soviets needed not only Baku, but their access to Azeri and other structures.
Right. And also they needed supplies. And it was this was the land route to get supplies to the Soviet Union that was in dire need of supplies, facing Hitler's Barbarossa. But another way to look at it is, there was a game of dominoes here. And suddenly, after 1941, after the invasion of Russia, the Middle East comes into play because you've got Stalin facing Hitler, who's advancing fast towards the Caucasus in 1941-42. And you've also got Rommel, first the Italians, but then Rommel and the Afrika Korps advancing across Libya into Egypt. And if either of these two offensives had succeeded, the Middle East would have fallen. So suddenly, Churchill and Hitler are looking at the Middle East. And one of the countries they're looking at is Iran. They're also looking, first of all, at Syria and Lebanon, which are now controlled by Hitler through the Vichy France.
And Admiral Darlan.
And Admiral Darlan, who's kind of deputy premier and a fascinating character. So they quickly invade Syria and Lebanon. Then they've got Iraq, which has fallen to pro-Nazi forces, Iraqi nationalists,
Kilani,
Islamists, including the Mufti, who is the sort of chief advisor to that regime, weirdly, the Mufti of Jerusalem, and they have to invade that too. So they do that. And also, they have an even bigger problem, which is Iran, run by the Shah, Reza Shah, who is the father of the famous Shah that we know. And he is actually a pretty fascinating nation builder. But in 1941, he tries to hedge himself about who will win the war, whether it's going to be the Nazis or the British side. That's a big mistake. And he calls it wrong. And Stalin and Churchill decide that they're not going to muck about with the possibility that this would happen. They just take it because of the reasons that you stated. They do regime change. They invade it. They defeat the Iranian army. And they overthrow and depose Reza Shah, and they put his son on the throne, who is a young boy, basically, a young man. And so Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the Shah, succeeds to the throne, but he's completely powerless. And there is in Iran a working constitutional system with elections, and the elections are relatively real. Of course, as in Egypt, contemporary Egypt, the elections are controlled by the same kind of potentates. The faction is very factional.
Elite
families, similar to the pashas of Egypt, and so you have people constantly being prime minister for many times.
But I think this is an important point, because when we go back and we look at Iran, you have to realize that it was more of a democracy than elsewhere, and that whether it was the Tudeh party, a kind of communist party where its ideas mattered, or Mossadegh with his anti-imperial nationalism, it had its own popular culture leading into politics. So therefore, any essentialization, they are like this, which is, we were attacking a kind of right-wing American podcaster.
Yes.
It's absurd if you begin to really understand the complexity of these societies.
So in the 40s and into the early 50s, you have this system where there are elections, where there are parties, where there is a parliamentary debate. It's pretty chaotic. They change prime ministers on a sort of almost kind of monthly basis, but it is a sort of constitutional monarchy, very similar to what's happening in another very sophisticated, multi-ethnic, multi-sectarian country, Egypt. And at the same time in Egypt, we're not talking about Egypt now, but there are similarities between these chaotic.
And I think the importance is that unlike many other states in the region, Iran and Egypt have authentic statehood and
That's
authentic
right.
boundaries.
They're
and it's something that we're
ancient- they're
going
ancient
to come
states.
back to is
Yes.
that the countries that have that degree of institutional continuity tend to be stronger.
Yeah.
And reasons why Turkey and Morocco function in ways that Syria and Libya don't. So let's
Correct.
pause that as an idea.
Correct. Like it. Yeah. I
Which
agree
we're
with
going to
that.
come back to. And I want to stick with Iran now. So Iran is obviously really in the news over the last months. And obviously Bibi and Trump scored a coup and a success in the 12-day war. And many people are not willing to admit that. But they had certain limited aims.
Yeah.
And I supported Trump's dropping the bunker buster, even though I think Trump is a complete moron, because it actually ended a war that Bibi would have continued, and it led to a possibility for negotiation. These guys are not completely warmongers, and then they walked into a quagmire from a position of strength to now finding themselves in a position of tremendous weakness. I'd like to call this the Hormuz War. You happen to call it the Third Gulf War in your book.
Yeah.
And I have many questions for you in this longer durée perspective. I think the thing that's happened is hubris. And this is a Herodotean thing. He got rid of Maduro and he's like, we could do anything. Look, we even just deposed this guy. And then in a context where it made no sense, of course, there wasn't going to be a collaborator that they could work with. Literally, there was no end plan. How do you see how they stumbled into this?
Well, my analysis is similar to yours. I think the 12-day war was actually, and again, unfashionable, because I think I'm highly critical of Trump's.
Well, we're quite similar, I think.
Yeah, Trump's general neo-Tsarism, as I call it. But you know, the point is that the 12-day war was actually superbly executed. They had the element of surprise. They had limited but very important and challenging aims, which they delivered on. So 12-day war was a kind of masterclass about how to conduct yourself in the Middle East. The war that was launched, the Third Gulf War, as I call it, that was launched on the 28th of February this year, has been an example of how not to conduct these wars, which is open-ended, over-ambitious, making completely unrealistic claims, and substituting impetuous but boldness for deep thinking and for advice. I mean, the Hormuz Straits have been kind of central to Iran's ambitions since Nadir Shah, but like in the oil era, the Shah himself really engineered the position they're in where this is possible, ironically, and we tell that story in the Cauldron. And
not only that, we have to go all the way back to Carter and Reagan, who said the one thing that we can never tolerate. If you've enjoyed this interview as much as I have, please join the Mega Orderers Club to get the second part of this interview, where we discuss how to fix the Middle East. If you enjoyed this interview as much as I do, and you want to hear the second part of the interview where we discuss cultural dysfunction in the Middle East, the fluid possibilities for new alliances, ways that there could be peace, if you want to get that immediately or sooner, join the Mega Orderers Club. And if you want to get some bonus material, particularly Sebag's view of solutions and ideas about Israel-Palestine and what can be done to fix it, and what can be done to mitigate Trump's ability to destabilize the region, we're having a bonus bit of content just for the Mega Orderers. Please join the Mega Orderers Club for that extra bonus content. The way to do that is going to disordershow.com/club. Disordershow.com/club. You'll get the second part of this interview early. You'll get the extra Ordering the Disorder about Sebag's views about Israel-Palestine and how Europe can push back against Trump's adventurism, all only for the Mega Orderers. It is the closing of the Straits, and we need to either work with the Shah or mitigate the way in which the Ayatollahs conduct themselves. And then we had the Iran-Iraq War from 1980 to 1988, where all these issues were at play. So I want to make you delve deeper into the psychology of Bibi, Trump, and then Mujtaba and the IRGC, because you do such a good job of sketching these characters.
Yeah.
So if Bibi and Trump were able to make successes, and Bibi more a tactical genius. How could they make this mistake? And am I missing something? Is there, any successes? Or is the media and the punditry essentially correct, which is that the Iranians are winning the war, and now the Ayatollahs are going to be much more difficult for their own people to dislodge?
I think both these things can be true at the same time. I think that obviously the big challenge with fighting people like regimes like the Iran regime is that we're fighting a different war than they are. They are an entity that is absolutely constructed to fight wars against superior Western powers.
Correct.
And because they have no fear of losing their own men. In fact, they have a cult of martyrdom and grievance that is perfect for fighting wars against technically superior opponents. They have a ideological structure of resistance. They also have a theological structure of apocalyptic Mahdiism, which means that like the idea of a kind of bigger war is not actually that terrifying to them, could be welcome. And of course, there are many different factions within Iran, which are almost, it's a black box, but it's almost impossible to tell who believes what. But there are definitely large factions in the command of Iran now that welcome a Mahdiist scenario of apocalypse. So they are fighting a different war, and they've worked out in the insurgency in Iraq against the Americans, and after 2003. They worked out that the Americans had a big weakness, which was losing people, and also short attention span, and also inconsistency, and also the fact that Americans have a weird system where they change governments all the time, which leads to erratic policies at the best of times, even when the system's working, which it isn't.
Yes.
So for all these reasons, they see an opportunity and they are using it. The sad thing about this war is that in terms of Western American Israeli aims, is that what really should have happened was a blockade at the beginning, without a war, with the threat of war, but a blockade, which really would have I think would have worked.
And then also, I think, certain support for the protesters in January, because the idea that we're going to have this regime change war 3 months after, but the 30,000 best and brightest young people have already been killed. And there are just so many nested tragedies. It's a tragedy for the Iranian people. It's a tragedy for the global economy. And then, ironically, it's actually a tragedy for U.S. and Israeli interests as well. Sure. And it's a tragedy for our allies in the region who are now much weakened. So before concluding this little bit on Iran, let's talk about Mujtaba. You mentioned him a bit. I didn't know until I read in your book, because I'm an Arabist, that he was chosen as an enforcer by his father during both the Iran-Iraq war and other moments to repress protests, and was important in the 2009 repression of the Green uprisings under Obama, where we covered ourselves in shame, again, by not helping the protesters. So how do you read whether or not he's sentient, whether or not he's alive, just what it means that we have a Mujtaba regime? Well,
I think what is interesting is there are a couple of points in this. One is the Mujtaba succession meant that the Khamenei dynasty continued. It was very interesting. Ayatollah Khomeini, the founder of the Republic, had said that it was a sin to create a hereditary monarchy.
Very clearly.
And
there's a long Shia tradition, by the way. Not only the Kharajites who don't do this at all, and they're kind of like they've left the Shia, but even within Twelver Shia, there's the idea that unless you're from the line of the Prophet and you're truly the descendant of Ali, it's a sin to have one of these Sunni-style caliphates, because then you're like Muawiyah.
Or Yazid and those people. So, but at the same time, the very fact that behind Shia is this hereditary line from Caliph Ali means that there is a hereditary principle there, however elevated. And there was a certain sort of propaganda coming out of the Khamenei family interests where they were talking about him as the Ali of the age and all this kind of stuff, which we all laughed about. And I just thought people were making that up until Mujtaba succeeded, when you suddenly realize that enough people believed in this idea that that this was a family that was worth backing in a dynastic way. I mean, we all laughed at that idea, didn't we? When we read about it in sort of articles, we thought like, well, that's surely never going to happen. Then no son is going to succeed, but they did. So that's one part of it. So one is continuity, but another thing is it's a new faction. It's his faction, which means that that these are really tough people, a tough group of generals that have always been there at the top of the Iran regime. And I don't think they're that different from Khamenei. I don't really buy into that. These people were all there in the Iran-Iraq war as really tough young men, with Soleimani, Vahidi, Jafari. These people are now in control. They are hardened, experienced people who really invented this strategy and invented it 20 years ago.
If you've enjoyed this interview as much as I have, please join the Mega Orderers Club to get the second part of this interview, where we discuss how to fix the Middle East. If you enjoyed this interview as much as I do, and you want to hear the second part of the interview where we discuss cultural dysfunction in the Middle East, the fluid possibilities for new alliances, ways that there could be peace, if you want to get that immediately or sooner, join the Mega Orderers Club. And if you want to get some bonus material, particularly Sebag's view of solutions and ideas about Israel-Palestine and what can be done to fix it, and what can be done to mitigate Trump's ability to destabilize the region, we're having a bonus bit of content just for the Mega Orderers. Please join the Mega Orderers Club for that extra bonus content. The way to do that is going to disordershow.com/club. disordershow.com/club. You'll get the second part of this interview early. You'll get the extra Ordering the Disorder about Sebag's views about Israel-Palestine and how Europe can push back against Trump's adventurism. All only for the Mega Orderers.